Welcome into the Jazz Notes podcast. I'm your host, Ben Anderson. You can find me on Twitter at Ben's Hoops, and of course, read me at KSLSports.com. You can also find us everywhere on social media at KSL Sports, Instagram, Twitter, X, Threads, Facebook, you name it. That's where we are going to be. So make sure and find us on KSL Sports, not just for your Utah Jazz needs, but everything with the college football season starting up. The best coverage in the state of all of your local teams and a lot of national teams as well. All right, not a lot of Jazz news, in all honesty, so we're going to get to the mailbag really quickly here. There just hasn't been much since the Jazz finalized finalized the roster last week with the Patty Mills addition. Now, I do think it's worth noting that Patty Mills remains unsigned officially, so the Jazz are maintaining some flexibility, but the roster's basically done, barring something unexpected, which certainly there's plenty of time before the season starts. Training camp doesn't open until October 1st, so we're still 35 days away from that. There's plenty of time for things to change, injuries to happen for other teams, Jazz having options for players that they could trade or acquire. I would keep an eye on that, but otherwise I don't expect a ton of news for the Jazz, maybe some off-season additions that can come in and work during training camp because you can carry up to 20 players, plus your 3 two-way guys during training camp and then wave them down before the opening night of the regular season, which is in mid to late October. All right, but let's just get to the mailbag. Every Tuesday at about 11 o'clock, I tweet out at Ben's Hoops the request for your questions. And if you send them in, we always like to answer them. And we try and do that as well as we can. If you're like Alex, who regularly likes to send in questions before the prompt, which I get if that's convenient for you, I will try to remember to answer them for you. And luckily today I did remember, and I think this is a good question. I think it's an interesting one. Alex says, mailbag question for you. Now that we've locked up Lowry long-term, where do you think he'll sit on the Jazz's all-time player rankings, assuming he sticks with the Jazz throughout his entire contract? So when we ranked the Jazz 50, the 50 greatest players in Jazz history before last season, going into their 50th season, Lauri Markkanen was already on the list and was already high on the list. Lowry was sitting at number 17. He was behind Ricky Green, Truck Robinson, Gordon Hayward, Mehmet Okur. He was behind Jeff Hornacek. I'll throw that in there, but there's a reason I left Jeff out. Those are guys, Andre Karolinko, who made one All-Star appearance in their Jazz career. Karolinko made one, Memo made one, Gordon made one, I think Truck only made one, Ricky Green made one. And that's why Lauri Markkanen was ahead of guys like Thurl Bailey. He was ahead of Mike Conley. Maybe he didn't deserve to be ahead of Mike Conley. Maybe Mike Conley was a better player, but we did a pretty wide, expansive ranking of these players. I think there's a real chance Lowry could end up in that number 10 range behind Andre Karolinko or in front of Andre Karolinko. I think right now the top 9 players are really set in whatever order you want to rank them, and I think it's going to be hard to break into that, barring being drafted and having a really long run here in Utah. Maybe at number 9 you could chip in, and here I'll just recap it for you. Karl Malone was 1, John Stockton 2, Pete Maravich 3, Adrian Dantley 4, Donovan Mitchell 5, Rudy Gobert 6. I think we flipped those around. Rudy should be better and higher than Donovan. Darren Williams 7, Mark Eaton 8, Carlos Boozer 9. That's a pretty good top 9, to be honest with you. I don't have any problems with those. Then you start getting into a little bit more subjective, one-time All-Star. Was Andre Karolinko actually better than Gordon Hayward? Maybe. He was here longer and has a lot of great career stats. He's on a lot of top 10 lists for the Utah Jazz all time. So I get putting him there. Was he actually better than Gordon Hayward in his prime? As their best player on the roster, Gordon did take the Jazz to the playoffs, and they won won a series against the Los Angeles Clippers. Karolinko didn't do that, but he was the 3rd or 4th best player on a team that made the conference finals. So how do you weigh those things? I think Lauri Markkanen is going to make at least one more All-Star game. I wouldn't rule out an All-NBA appearance, and if he does that, he's better than Karolinko. He's certainly going to be better than Darrell Griffith, better than Memo, better than Jeff Hornacek, though we know Jeff's value coming in the 90s. I think better than Hayward there. Truck Robinson and Ricky Green, those are always going to be hard. Truck is probably a little bit underrated on this list, in all honesty, but was on some terrible Jazz teams, but was a really good player in his own right. So if I were to bet that Markkanen's here for the next 5 years. That's the 1 year remaining on his deal and the 4-year extension. I think really easily he jumps up to 10, and he could pass Carlos Boozer, though Booz did win a gold medal as a Jazz man, 2 All-Star appearances, made an All-NBA team. Carlos Boozer was really good. He just wasn't here very long. Lowry might be more beloved than Carlos, so maybe he can crack that top 9. But I would feel confident saying that if Markkanen sticks for 5 years, the Jazz haven't traded him because he's been really good, or he's been really bad. I don't think he's going to be really bad, but they don't trade him because he's been really good, and they just think it's better to hold on to him even with this new contract. So he jumps up to 10, and he eclipses Kirilenko and Griffith and Okur and Hornacek. So that's probably where I'd put him. It was already kind of hard to put him at 17 after one good season, but you remember his one good season in Utah. He made an all-star team, actually started, borderline all-NBA, most improved player, and then last year didn't reach those accolades but was still very good. If he just maintains this level, stays at one all-star game, but does it for another 5 years, I still think he probably jumps up to 11. Maybe he doesn't eclipse Kirilenko in some fans' eyes, but he's probably a better Kirilenko a better player than Kirilenko because what he does is more valuable. He scores, and that's what your number one goal is in the NBA. That's why it's called a field goal. The goal is to score and get the ball in the hole, and that's what Lauri Markkanen does. So relatively not safe bet, but decent odds that he ends up as the 10th best player in Jazz history if he plays out his days. And you know what? What you're hoping for is somebody jumps him. Jazz get a draft pick or trade for a player or one of these guys already on the roster proves to be your next Donovan Mitchell, Rudy Gobert type that is no question better than that group 10 to 15 because that's what the Jazz need if they want to win a championship. All right, next question from Crunch Factor. Do the Jazz want to trade Kessler? I don't think they're dying to trade Walker Kessler. I think for the right package, though, he's very movable. He's not untouchable by any means. And, a couple of years ago, last summer, I guess, he was in that untouchable conversation that Tim McMahon reported at ESPN. Now, so was Ochai Agbaji, and Ochai's gone. These aren't guys that the Jazz drafted. And even if they did draft a guy, I don't think necessarily the Jazz would be unwilling to move anybody. But I don't think the Jazz feel like they have to have Walker Kessler off the roster before the season starts. I don't know why they would feel that way. Walker, worst case scenario, is a really good backup. And one thing I think you need to be careful of, and you see it a lot more with coaches than you do players, is like basing the rest of their tenure with your program, whether that's team or whatever, on their first year of success and then being disappointed with everything they do after that. Remember, Jeff Hornacek goes down to Phoenix as the head coach, and they have a really good year. They were expected to be terrible. They win over 40 games. I don't know if they make the playoffs or not, but he sets a really high bar. And then the next year, they were the team everyone expected them to be, and they dropped down to 25 wins, and they fired Jeff Hornacek. And well, this guy's an idiot. It's well, actually, his first year was really good. He maybe just impossibly set the bar high, and if he had reversed those and gone 25 wins to 40 wins, you would have been in love with him. So don't base too much off of great first year, bad second year, and think that we have a good idea of what he's going to be. I mean, you would be certainly selling low on Walker Kessler right now, but if you think he's going to be exposed as somebody who can't play in the NBA, I guess if you could get a first-round pick from a New Orleans or whatever, you would do that. But, I'm guessing the Jazz have gotten reasonable offers for him. Clearly there was a conversation with the New York Knicks, and the Jazz turned it down and decided to hold on to Walker. So the nice thing is it's he was a major piece in the Rudy Gobert trade. He kind of was a throw-in, but ended up being one of the better faces, really the only player who's still around on the team from that trade that didn't come from one of the draft picks. So there's value there, but if you move on from him, he was a 22nd overall pick. He wasn't a lottery pick. He wasn't a top 5 pick. In fact, you probably lost more in giving up Ochai Agbaji, who was a lottery pick that you hoped would had a higher hit factor than Walker Kessler. Also, man, look at the draft. Every year there's a Walker Kessler, and that's not a knock on Walker. Those guys are valuable, but Donovan Clingan went top 10 this year. You just see these types of players. Derek Lively got drafted just outside of the top 10 by Dallas a year and a half ago, or in the 2023 draft. There are good centers that become available and rim running centers that have value. So if you do move on from Walker Kessler, and he's an elite rim protector, and that has real value, but if you do move on from him, you could replace him. And not only could you replace him, you probably don't have to use, your own first round pick this year. You have your pick from Minnesota, you have the pick from Cleveland. You could probably use one of those to draft a center next year, the same way Walker Kessler fell out of the top 20 because people recognized his limitations. in college. And I think some of those have come to fruition in the NBA, though he's been better as a rim protector than I think most people even anticipated, despite the fact that he was a record-setting shot blocker during his sophomore season in college. So I don't think the Jazz want to trade him. If the right deal came along, would they? I believe they would. Sammy Paradise on Twitter. Are there any players on the other rosters you think are undervalued that the Jazz could take a chance on a trade for? That also wouldn't help them win too many games this season. I do think that is the key, is you don't want to win too many games. So there are always players who are undervalued on their roster and could, be better in a bigger role. Instead of going through 30 NBA rosters or 29 other NBA rosters, though, maybe the thing I would take a look at is where you're finding success with kind of these young players who are stepping up out of nowhere and playing well. And Vince Williams probably doesn't count because he was drafted by the Memphis Grizzlies, but he's 22, I think, when he got drafted. Keon Ellis, you remember last year, played really well for the Sacramento Kings. Some of these 3-and-D guys who are just a little bit underappreciated, maybe you just cycle through them on 10-day contracts and non-guaranteed deals, and you bring them in, you give them a chance to audition, as opposed to trying to find some magic in Davion Mitchell because the Kings gave up on him, and I know he's going to Toronto right now, but, I'll always look at it through the Jazz's perspective. You're a Jazz fan, so you're pretty intimately aware of who these guys are. When the Jazz traded Ochai Agbaji, every fan in Toronto was like, oh man, Jazz don't know what they're giving up. This is a 6'7" super athlete, just won most outstanding player at the NCAA tournament. He must be a great player. He's a great shooter in college, just hasn't gone in the NBA, but we'll fix that. Now flip it from your perspective as a Jazz fan when you watched him play 70 games and you know exactly what he is. Well, the shot didn't fall. The athleticism is there, but it didn't translate in the half court ever. He was okay in transition. The defense was fine, but it wasn't like he was a lockdown defender. He's a little bit older than rookies in his class. So the upside's not really there. And he got lots of chances, and he never really took advantage of them. And in fact, other guys in those similar roles did the same thing or better and were younger. So when you're thinking of who's this other guy you could go out and acquire who maybe their own team and their own fans who have seen him play a lot and don't like him, maybe there's something there I could fix. I think you always need to be hesitant with that. So I'm always cautious with that versus, especially when there's a draft pick behind him and teams have invested a lot in these guys and they will give them multiple opportunities to prove that they were right by drafting them, like Isaiah Williams. You just kind of keep betting on these guys that you drafted so the GM doesn't look stupid. I like some of these guys that go under the radar, get drafted in the second round, are good but miss out on, roster cuts at the very end of the training camp deadline when you have to cut your players and finalize your roster. I think those guys tend to end up being a little bit more interesting, and while there might not be as much bang for your buck, they can end up being good performers on solid teams. And, look at how good Chris Dunn was. That was a guy who had been given up on, but the Jazz didn't even have to go and trade for him. They just kind of waited for him to wash out of the NBA, and then they gave him a chance when he was a little bit older. And he gave him a good year and a half. Jimbo Slice. I think this is a real question. That's unique from Jimbo, so appreciate him weighing in somewhat honestly. He says, I get that the front office wants to tank, but does Will Hardy understand that? How do you coach to lose? Do you just play the young guys? Do we know he really wants to do that, or does he just want the front office, or does he just do what the front office tells him to? Well, the Jazz give Will Hardy a lot of freedom to be Will Hardy. What the Jazz can do is not sign good players in the offseason that he can rely on that are obviously better than the players that he has. So, look, today, and I think this is what fans do need to recognize, Svi Mykhailiuk is better than Cody Williams today. Now, 3 months from now, can Cody Williams catch up? Probably can't even then. Probably won't be better, actually, than Svi Mykhailiuk at any point in his rookie season. Now, he's more naturally talented. He's got better physical tools. Some of the things he's going to be able to do naturally are better than what Svi Mykhailiuk does. But Svi's been in the NBA for 6 years now. One, I think, did win a title, or at least went to the Final Four at Kansas. He's played a lot of basketball. He has won a title with the Boston Celtics. You learn a lot. You gain a lot of corporate knowledge by being in the NBA that long, and that's going to make you better. The problem is, what's the upside for Will Hardy playing Svi Mykhailiuk on a 1-year guaranteed contract with the final 3 years of the deal not guaranteed? Probably not a whole lot. So you put Will Hardy in a situation where logically it even makes sense to just go with Cody Williams, even if he's not the better player, versus a guy who's on a 2 or a 3-year deal, Jordan Clarkson, Colin Sexton, obviously Larry Markkanen's so good you got to play him. John Collins on these long-term deals that they're going to be around for a while. It's easy to excuse why you would play those guys. It's a little harder to excuse why you would play guys on a 1-year non-guaranteed deal, even when you're a coach like Will Hardy, who I do think generally wants to win and believes that there's no unearned minutes and that the best way for guys to learn how to play is to earn those minutes and then play in a culture that values winning, not a culture that values losing. And, you look at where he started in San Antonio and where he was in Boston. Those aren't cultures that valued losing. They wanted to win. And so I think he's going to continue to play that way, though I will, point you towards the Jazz's schedule last year, and you kind of got a taste of both of that. Last week of the season, out of nowhere, the Jazz win back-to-back games over the Houston Rockets and the LA Clippers, and it was just like the Jazz went from locking up, I think having the 8th worst record, to that really being in doubt going into the final game of the season. And then against the Warriors, even though you knew Steve Kerr wasn't going to be playing his guys, the Jazz just pulled the plug on everybody. Will Hardy didn't play any of the main guys because he recognized, it's going to be way better to not win this game. So Taylor Hendricks played 41 minutes. Omer Yurtseven played 29 minutes. Lukas Šamanić played 28 minutes. Keontae George only played 20. Johnny Juzang played 20. Bryce Sensabaugh played 28. Kyra Lewis Jr. played 27 minutes for the Utah Jazz in that game. Will Hardy understood what was on the line, that it was better to get a lottery pick there, and was willing to play the young guys. So the Jazz start off with a worse roster than they had last season because Will Hardy, or the front office, does not give him the talented players to rely on. So he kind of has to play the young guys, and then they say late in the season, hey man, this is about the drafts. You want to get better picks. It'll make your life easier in the long run, and you have job security, which is why they gave him the 5-year deal right off the bat. And he feels confident playing the young guys. I think that's how you do it, though. There's still going to be some games early in the season I think the Jazz win that fans aren't going to be happy with, and they're going to blame Will Hardy for taking the season too seriously. Jamie Strong on Twitter, do you think Cooper Flagg is worth the hype? I believe his offensive game is way behind of the games I've seen. He's certainly a better defensive player at this point, but you look at going toe-to-toe offensively with some of the guys at Team USA, and he looked the part. Obviously, everyone's excited to watch Duke this year. I am as well, and see where he is and see how that offensive game translates. The nice thing is when you've got a player with his offensive upside because of his athleticism and his playmaking, and he's shown some shooting, when he's as good as he is defensively, that's a huge plus. When you have a guy who can carry, let's just rank it out of 10, like a 6 workload out of 10. Let's say Donovan Mitchell was like an 8, just to give you a sense, or Lauri Markkanen's an 8. If Cooper Flagg could carry a 7 workload and still be a very, very, very high plus defender, that really goes a long way. Those are the two-way stars that help you win championships in the NBA. Jaylen Brown doesn't carry a 9 offensive workload. He can for stretches. He can for playoff series. But he is good enough defensively, really good defensively, that he really adds a lot to your roster, even if he's not Kevin Durant offensively. That having a guy that's that good of a two-way player is really valuable. So yes, Cooper Flagg in that sense I think is worth the hype, and his ceiling is relatively high because he's such a good defensive player as well. And then the offense comes along, if it does, at his size, with his athleticism, it really works out. And then the nice thing, again, about this draft, I think is important to remember, this is not Victor Wembanyama and everybody else, even though, Brandon Miller's turned into a good player and everyone thought Scoot was going to be a superstar. We'll see if he gets there. This is 6 guys at the top of this draft that people really like, that they think have a chance to be all-stars. So even if it's, not Cooper Flagg, maybe he ends up as the 3rd best player, or maybe he is the best player, but the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th guys out of this draft, probably not in that draft order, but the guys simply coming out of that draft, you're going to get that much talent that maybe you do end up with 5 all-stars, and it's one of these more generational drafts that we see once a decade, or however you want to rank it. Benjamin Smith on Twitter. Am I crazy to think that Ingram would be a good sign-and-trade option after this season? If the Jazz did that, who would that hurt the most out of the young players? Brandon Ingram really is a ball-in-hand player, so it would probably hurt Keontae George, who also has the ball in his hand a lot. I think people would look at his size and say, well, of course that's going to hurt Cody. I think it would hurt Keontae George because Brandon Ingram needs the ball. Even though he doesn't shoot threes, he likes to get to the mid-range. He likes to make plays. He's a pretty good pick-and-roll player. So I think that's where his advantage is, and that would hurt George, which, you know what? The Jazz might be willing to hurt Keontae George after this season if he doesn't shoot the ball a lot better and doesn't start to perform a lot better as one of the lead guards, whether he's a point guard or a shooting guard, whatever you think position he plays. It's kind of the question about Brandon Ingram, too, who's kind of a playmaking 2-3, even plays a little bit of the 4, but is a playmaker and likes to have the ball in his hands. So anyone who's going to rely on that rhythm, bringing in somebody like Brandon Ingram would hurt that. And Brandon Ingram's really interesting, and Keontae's interesting because I wrote an article on the Jazz improving their shooting in the offseason. And you look at Keontae's shooting numbers, he was so bad as a catch-and-shoot shooter, stand still, spot-up shooter. He's at like 31%. But when he has a dribble, 2 dribbles, up to 6 dribbles, he's really good. He's like 36% and higher. A couple of the spots, he's like 40%. He didn't take a ton of those. He took a lot where he dribbled 7 times or more and then shot threes, which are just, dreadful possessions for the Jazz. Either he's not getting the ball where it needs to go, or the offense isn't being run correctly and he's having to hoist up some terrible shots. But when he's in a rhythm and has like kind of a little bit of a bounce going to him, he's a pretty reliable 3-point shooter, speaking of Keontae. So if he can get back to that and the Jazz can utilize that fully, I think his efficiency is going to expand and grow, and I think that's where he can have some real value for the Jazz. I think that's all the mailbag questions for today. Oh, one more from Jake the Lynx. We'll tack this on with Walker Kessler. He says, Walker looked fantastic his rookie year, but his second year has been well criticized. What would it have to look like, or what would Walker have to do to have a successful third season and undisputedly claim the starting center spot? How possible do you think that is? Honestly, I think a lot of it for Walker is effort. He seemed to get down on himself after the slow start to the season, and then he lost his starting job to John Collins and never really seemed fully engaged. And when he plays really hard, he's still very good. He runs the floor. He catches the ball. He's not afraid to dunk on people. He blocks a ton of shots. And then sometimes it seems like his interest wanes and he kind of can be slow up the floor, which he's as big and fast as he is. That should never be an issue. That just kind of seems to be the main problem. And there were times when it seemed like Taylor Hendricks was really outplaying him and really outworking him. And so you just didn't know what Walker Kessler you were going to get every night you took the floor. And, when you have John Collins, who is far from a perfect player, but is pretty easy to dial in what to expect most evenings, that helps a coach. Will Hardy's not guessing which guy you're getting. It's not Jekyll and Hyde. And I thought a little bit too much of Walker Kessler was Jekyll and Hyde. So just consistency. And one of the ways you can be consistent is giving the right effort every night. So I think that would be a good key for Walker. And look, he may not be able to do that off the bench. He may be a guy who needs to start to understand that or have that belief from the coaches. And if he can't be a starter or he can't be a guy on this team at this moment because there may not be a starting spot for him, because I don't know if the Jazz are ready to move John Collins to the bench. In fact, I would bet that they don't. I think he still starts the season at center. All right. Thanks to everybody who sent in your questions, as always, every Tuesday. Follow me on Ben's Hoops. I send out the prompt at 11 o'clock, ask for your questions, and you can get them answered, and then I write up an article about it as well. To follow up, follow me on Twitter at KSL Sports. Read us at Facebook, Threads, Instagram, Twitter, everywhere you get your news. We will be there. We'll be back with you again next week.